Thanks to our session sponsor, Panasonic is your #1 source for ventilation needs in new and existing homes. Panasonic features many different products to ventilate bathrooms right, or to use exhaust only, or even whole house exhaust strategies, including more affordable solutions, motion sensors, timers, condensation sensors, and even ERVs. The IntelliBalance 100 is an International Builder Show 2017 Best of Award winner, a customizable high-performance, high-efficiency energy recovery ventilator that can be used in any climate to meet ASHRAE 62.2. Pick-a-flow speed selectors, 50 to 100 CFM, provide truly customizable airflow, balanced, positive, or negative pressure. Connect to existing ductwork or use as a standalone in whole house ventilation solutions. Mervate's included for the filtration, but can be upgraded to 13. And an exchange capillary core recovers heat, energy, and moisture. Looking for something a little bit cheaper to hit a balance strategy? Pair this with a Whisper Green bath fan. It's the Select Cycler, and this will bring in air through the furnace intake and exhaust it through the bath fan for a balanced approach. Add in a range hood pressure sensor to activate the system when makeup air is needed during cooking. So make sure to check out Panasonic for all of your clients' ventilation needs. All right, well, welcome to Resilient Design in an Age of Climate Change. This course is approved for 1 hour in continuing education units, GBCI, AIBD, NARI Green, BPI, NonWholeHouse, as well as AIA, HSW, which may make it applicable to your local state-based design or contractor license. Today I will be your moderator, and my name is Brett Little, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Green Home Institute. So today we're going to be looking at why do we need building resiliency and what strategies can we use to get there. And so I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Alex Wilson. He's the president of Resilient Design Institute, an organization that has been working to advance practical strategies for enhancing the resilience of buildings and communities since 2012. He is also the founder of Building Green Incorporated, Brattleboro, Vermont company that has been working since 1985 to advance green building through publications and contract work. Alex is a widely published writer, and he has served on the National Board of the U.S. Green Building Council from 2000 through 2005. He received the 2008 U.S. Green Building Council Leadership Award for Education and the 2010 Hanley Award for Vision and Leadership in Sustainability. So with that, Alex, welcome, and please take it away.
Thanks, Brett, and it's great to be here. I should note that I've been a fan of Panasonic fans, so to speak, for years. Great product. Always have been the quietest and most dependable, so I'm glad to see they've sponsored this event. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to talk this afternoon for a bit about resilient design in an age of climate change, and address a bunch of issues, sort of a little bit of my own background and how I got interested in resilience, why this issue is so important today and becoming more important all the time, and then getting into some practical strategies for enhancing our resilience, both resilience of buildings and, to a lesser extent, communities. I'm not going to focus as much on communities as buildings today. Anyway, so about myself, I got involved with renewable energy first in college in the mid-70s, and then working in Santa Fe, New Mexico in the late 70s, advancing passive solar design. New Mexico was sort of the epicenter of the emergence of passive solar design in the 70s. We did some really neat work for a number of years, leading construction workshops around the state of New Mexico of attached solar greenhouses, trom walls, measures like that. I'm in that left photo wearing the hat, carefully disguised. So, you know, as I said, that area became the epicenter of passive solar design. It built on the thermal mass in the buildings that had been used for centuries in southwestern architecture. And that work in passive solar really played a key role in my focus on resilience, and I'll explain why as we go along. In 1980, I moved to New England to become executive director of what at the time was called the New England Solar Energy Association. It's now the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association. But in that role, I really broadened my focus away from just renewable energy, and in fact changed the name of the organization to focus on broader issues of energy efficient construction and sustainability, not just renewable energy. And we started a series of conferences then, back in 1983, that is now the Building Energy Conference, which is a great event if you're in the Northeast, held each year in Boston. I highly recommend that event. After leaving NESE in 1985, I started my own company, now Building Green. And in that company, we launched a newsletter back in 1992, Environmental Building News. It was really the first publication in North America focused on this nascent idea of green building. Bob Berkebile was on our advisory board from day one, a real pioneer in green building, founder of the AIA Committee on the Environment. And, you know, we sort of wrote about this industry as it grew and became a pretty large industry. The Green Build Conference today is one of the largest conferences annually in the building trades. In fact, there are only a half dozen or so places they can hold it anymore because of its size. And we've also watched really the blossoming of green building. You know, we saw the LEED rating system and then some even more robust standards like Passive House and the Living Building Challenge. Shown here is the Bullitt Center in Seattle, Washington. A really cool building, a 50,000 square foot office building that's net zero energy. It generates all of its power for this 4-story building or 5-story building on the roof. That cap that it wears that extends beyond the building footprint. They had a very robust list of chemicals they had to avoid in the building materials for the building. They capture rainwater, they compost human waste. It's a pretty amazing building. If you're in Seattle, I'd encourage you to take a look at it, or if you're visiting Seattle. So then, you know, how did I get into resilience? When Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005, you know, I was editing Environmental Building News, and we wrote an editorial right after Katrina happened. We had an issue going to the printer and, you know, got that article into it at the last minute. And, you know, really looking at what was wrong with New Orleans being a city that was located below sea level in an era when sea levels were going to be rising. And we had some pretty radical ideas that we presented in that editorial. But through that, I got pulled into a process to look at how the reconstruction in the Gulf Coast could be guided to make it more sustainable. That effort was led by a number of chapters of the U.S. Green Building Council based in the Midwest, specifically in St. Louis, Missouri, and Little Rock, Arkansas. And we held a series of charrettes, or design meetings, in Atlanta that fall, coinciding with the Green Build Conference. We brought a bunch of people, I think about 30, up from the Gulf Coast to participate in this multi-day meeting. And out of that wrote the New Orleans principles. One of those principles was this concept of providing for passive survivability. And by this we meant that buildings should be designed and built to maintain livable conditions. You know, and in watching the coverage of Katrina as the disaster unfolded, we saw people evacuated to the Superdome in New Orleans and then having to evacuate the Superdome because it was 105 degrees in there and 90% relative humidity. You know, it wasn't a livable building without the mechanical and electrical systems needed to air condition it. Similarly, we saw with homes that weren't flooded in the Gulf Coast, but nonetheless lost power for weeks and in some cases months, we saw that older buildings built before the presence of air conditioning tended to be much more livable than new buildings built since the advance of air conditioning. So, those older buildings were designed with what's called vernacular architecture, features that, that were responsive to the bioclimate. So these homes had wraparound porches that shaded the windows from direct sun. They were designed for ventilation airflow through the buildings. They often had tall ceilings that stratified the air. They had outdoor living spaces. They made sense for that climate. So we posited that in new construction today and in retrofit work, we should be striving for buildings that will work at least as well as the buildings our grandparents were putting up back in the 1930s and 20s, buildings that exhibited this passive survivability. So using the vernacular design ideas from our grandparents and great-grandparents and combining those with the best materials today. This was not rocket science. We had a pretty well-developed knowledge base of passive design. We could do this. And so in this New Orleans Principles, we articulated that idea. And I then spent the next 5 years pretty actively promoting that idea, in speaking around the country and in articles about resilience. I gradually came to refer to this concept under the banner of resilience or resilient design, being a little less off-putting than this term passive survivability. I think I got the sense that people would imagine survivalism bunkers in Alabama or Idaho when I would talk about passive survivability. Anyway, so resilience is a little different from sustainability. It's the capacity to adapt to changing conditions and to maintain or regain functionality and vitality in the face of stress or disturbance. So it's the capacity to bounce back after a disturbance or interruption. And I like to think of it as not only the idea of bouncing back, but bouncing forward. So, fixing a building that's damaged, but going beyond what was there before and using the renovation as an opportunity to make it better, make it more resilient, more energy efficient, more sustainable. So why do this? Why focus on resilience? This webinar focuses in part on climate change and what's happening. And these are pretty stark statistics. And you can deny the reality of climate change. A lot of people do. But for anyone who looks at the data, and my background is in biology, so I look at scientific data, and it's pretty clear to me that the trends we're seeing are very real, both the temperature trends shown in the upper left here and the carbon dioxide levels measured on a Hawaiian volcano in the upper atmosphere going back to the 1950s, pretty clear trends showing rising temperatures and rising carbon dioxide levels, which will further increase temperature as we move along. So, we see the impacts of this. I started, in addition to doing a lot of writing about this and speaking about it, I took a sabbatical in 2011 and used that as an opportunity to think about what was next for me personally in the latter days of my career, what was next for our company, Building Green, and what was next for the green building movement. And I focused a lot of that 8-month sabbatical on resilience, thinking that that was where I wanted to focus attention, because I saw resilience as another motivation for getting people to build greener buildings, more sustainable buildings. Maybe you aren't engaged with the environmental aspects of green building, but you probably want to keep your family safe. Even if you deny climate change, even if you're not concerned about the environmental degradation that's happening, you want to keep your family safe. I focused on that during this sabbatical. At the end of that sabbatical, as I was sort of heading back to reality, Irene happened. This was a tropical storm that dumped a large amount of rain in Vermont and surrounding states in late 2011. So we saw scenes like this where roads got washed away, whole towns were cut off, in some cases for up to a week, where they had to helicopter supplies in or cut new roads through mountains that were accessible by ATV. But it was a kind of a wake-up call, and this, was the outcome of 10 inches of rain in a very short period of time. And so I began, thinking about launching a nonprofit. We thought about possibly shifting Building Green to focus more on resilience, but decided to launch a separate nonprofit organization, sort of a spin-off from Building Green. So in early 2012, I launched the Resilient Design Institute. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization working to advance resilience. And I thought when I launched it, there probably wouldn't be a lot of interest in resilience until or unless there was some other big event. And lo and behold, 6 months later, Sandy came along. This massive hurricane or a superstorm that wreaked tremendous damage in the New York City metropolitan area and the Mid-Atlantic, and that really brought resilience into the mainstream, and I think it made it the word of the year. We've since seen a lot of other events. Last year was a particularly significant one, up to 50 inches of rain in the Houston area. Hurricane Irma that hit the Caribbean and Florida. And this is an amazing satellite photo showing 3 tropical storms. Hurricane Irma is that large system in the center that's nearing Florida. And Hurricane Jose is coming along right behind it to the right. And then there's tropical storm Katie to the left into the western Gulf of Mexico. Anyway, pretty amazing photo there. Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, and the country or the island state is still recovering from that and will be for months and even years to come. Hopefully, I talked about bouncing forward. There are some great stories in Puerto Rico where some of the, last generation energy infrastructure is being replaced by new distributed generation. And, there are opportunities to, end up with something better than what was there before. But it's certainly been a challenge for people in Puerto Rico. And then we had the California wildfires, which were really bizarre to, we used to think of wildfires as being a risk in this urban wildland interface. But here in 2017, we saw, some, very suburban towns literally leveled. This is Santa Rosa, where a significant number of homes, percentage of homes were simply burned to the ground. And it was a combination of very dry weather following a very wet year. So there was a great deal of vegetative growth. It created a buildup of fuel. And then there was a period of time where very high winds coincided with, these kindled fires, and, fires swept through very, very quickly. Some people not getting out in time to survive that. That was followed a number of months later by mudslides. The ground damaged by loss of vegetation became susceptible to landslides, and we saw Montecito, California, heavily damaged by mudslides. So, one of the impacts of climate change appears to be, based on evidence going back 50 years, seems to be an increase in intense storms. In the Northeast, where we're based, this is particularly a concern, a 74% increase from 1958 to 2011, that really all parts of the country have seen an increase in these intense precipitation events, which here are defined as the heaviest 1% of all precipitation events. And even in areas where there may be less total rainfall, the Southwest, for example, that rainfall tends to be coming in larger dollops. So, rainfall that would previously or ordinarily infiltrate the ground and recharge aquifers is instead running off and becoming a flood hazard. We saw that this week, a couple of days ago in Ellicott City, Maryland. Tremendous flooding from torrential rains, and this was the second 1,000-year storm in this area in the last 5 years. There's an interesting message in that statistic. Heat waves are becoming more common. We've been seeing this. 2012 was particularly hot. We're seeing more and more areas that are exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit for a significant number of days. We're seeing shifting ecosystems. This map is a pretty scary map if you're trained in ecology as I am, showing the effect of climate of Vermont moving south, given different scenarios of global warming. So we see Vermont by the end of the century becoming a climate more like Ohio or even Tennessee. So pretty dramatic impact on ecosystems. And we'll see if natural native ecosystems can adapt quickly enough. There might be situations where we need to aid the migration of forest ecosystems. In our woodland in Vermont, I've been planting some species that are a little bit more southern adapted, white oak, which were at the northern end of the range. So I've been preferentially selecting for trees like that, hoping that if something happens to our northern species like sugar maple, that there might be other native but more southern species ready to fill in that ecological niche. Tornadoes, these convective cells that happen with thunderstorms, can be a significant problem. 2011 was a particularly significant year for tornadoes. Here's the Joplin tornado, an EF5 tornado that left a 1/4 mile wide track, extended 6 miles, 157 fatalities. But it was one of almost 1,700 tornadoes that were recorded in 2011. And lest we think that tornadoes are only a problem in Missouri and Oklahoma and the tornado belt, we've, until fairly recently, the most damaging or highest fatality tornado in American history was in Massachusetts in 1953, an F5 tornado that hit Worcester, killing 94 people. A pretty significant event. Earthquakes and tsunamis aren't climate change related, at least most of them, but nonetheless they contribute to vulnerability, particularly in the western U.S. There's some areas in Oklahoma where our extraction of fossil fuels is contributing to seismic activity, but most earthquakes and tsunamis are at a much deeper geological level. That's something we need to be planning for. Then there's drought and water shortage, and we've seen photos like this one on the left showing Lake Mead with its famous bathtub ring. In 2015, it dropped to 37% of capacity, the water level. But, even so, those western reservoirs like Mead have a huge capacity. They can last several years without significant recharge because they're very deep. In the east, on the other hand, places, reservoirs like Lake Lanier near Atlanta tend to be shallow, and they're much more vulnerable to drought. So in late 2007, when there was an extensive drought in the east, Lake Lanier dropped to almost empty. It fell to within 30 days of running out of water. Not a shortage of water, but running out of water. And there was really no plan for what to do about that. The governor asked residents of the state to pray for rain, and apparently that worked. It did start raining again, and kept them from the brink of that disaster. But we may not be so lucky next time. There's a great resource, the U.S. Drought Monitor. You can go online to this and see the current drought conditions. The larger map on the left is the U.S. drought conditions as of a few days ago, May 22nd. And you can see how drought areas move around the country. A few years ago, the smaller map on the right showing very significant drought in California and the Pacific Northwest, and also Texas, Louisiana area. So a good resource can help us understand what's going on. Today we're seeing significant drought in the Southwest. One of the reasons that people don't often think about that drought is a significant concern is that our U.S. power generation is very dependent on water. We have hydro plants, those are obviously based on water, and when there's less water flow in our rivers, the dams that provide hydropower can generate less electricity. But also, most of our conventional plants, which account for 89% of U.S. electricity generation, are thermal electric plants. These are plants that use some heat source, whether it's coal, burning natural gas, or reacting uranium, to generate heat. And that heat then boils water, creates high pressure steam that turns steam turbines, and then that steam has to be condensed back into water, and the water returned to wherever it was drawn from. So most of these plants are very dependent on a water source. That's why they're located next to rivers or reservoirs or the ocean. And during extreme drought, those power plants can become at risk. That 2007 drought I mentioned in the east, that put 20-some nuclear plants at risk of shutting down in the southeast. One of those plants did shut down, a Tennessee Valley Authority plant, because they ran out of cooling water. So a significant concern. Here we see reservoirs in California, and the water level in those reservoirs, ranging from 30%, one of them 18%, very low levels in 2014. So these go up and down based on rainfall, but it's interesting to keep an eye on those. Okay, so, if there's a extended drought that causes a power outage, or there's a storm that causes a power outage, or some other event, the impacts are pretty severe. This photo is the lower Manhattan, the blackout that was caused by Hurricane Sandy in October 2012, putting most of lower Manhattan into blackout conditions. Our energy distribution system is fairly vulnerable. We have 160,000 miles of high voltage power distribution lines, 3,400 power plants, 150 refineries, 2.5 million miles of oil and gas pipelines. Each of these is a point of vulnerability, and something that we need to be aware of. Often there are secondary impacts that can occur. We saw with Sandy, gas stations running out of power, or running out of gasoline, or being unable to pump that gasoline because they didn't have backup power. So those gas stations that had gasoline, You know, there were long lines, people waiting to fuel up their vehicles. Even people that were prepared, that had home generators, they had to fuel those generators. And, you know, they were standing in lines to fill up their gasoline tanks from those limited gas stations that were open. There are other vulnerabilities that I won't get into much, coronal discharges or space weather, you know, these magnetic storms that could damage transformers at the utility industry, health emergencies like pandemics, terrorist actions, and cyber terrorism. And this last one, cyber terrorism, is kind of an increasing concern. If you get a chance, Ted Koppel's 2016 book, Lights Out, is a pretty eye-opening book on the vulnerability of our electrical grid to hackers. And there's now evidence that foreign governments or terrorist organizations are sort of testing our security and figuring out how to break into those, how to hack into those grids and impact our power supply.